podcast. Oh, let me start again. Hello, world. This is the Know Your Place podcast. Have my microphone turned off. Anyway, on this week's episode, we're going to talk about, well, this is episode 46. We're going to talk about state borders. Yes. Now, I don't know how many of you. This is more of a sort of topic I'm talking about for my international listeners. There are definitely American listeners too who probably don't know all of the information I'm going to detail in this little chat, but it is a sort of an interesting thing for outsiders to listen to. Merry Christmas, everyone! This podcast will probably be posted on Christmas Eve, so. Wow. Yes, I'm working hard here. Anyway, yes, and the reason why I decided to sort of talk about this topic is sort of loose, but we'll roll with it anyway. Is that with the federal government being shut down, at least partially shut down this weekend, I thought it would be interesting to sort of talk about stuff from a bygone era where states used to wield more power because, states are wielding more power right now, technically speaking. Although I do imagine the federal government will reopen again sometime soon. Um, anyway, so yeah, let's roll back the clock and have something fun here. Now, there are lots of different ways that the boundaries of states are still disputed even up to this day. A lot of people, I think, assume that the state boundaries in America are set in stone. And I mean, to a large degree, they are. You're not going to, even if there was a dispute, it's not like a lot of people take it to court or fight it real hard anymore. That was more of an 1800s thing. But so there was a guy whose side it was, or the History Channel side that it was a great idea to make a show about this concept, actually. And they made a show it was loosely based on a best selling novel also called How the States Got Their Shapes, which I encourage everybody to look up if they haven't read it. And I haven't read all of it, but it's still a very fascinating novel. And the show was really interesting. The first season was. The second season was kind of a dud, in my opinion. But the first season was very interesting. And there's several different kinds of disputes over borders and secession and all kinds of other things. But that's not. I'm going to only take this podcast. This is such a deep subject, okay, that I'm only on this podcast going to talk about one facet of these kind of things, and that is actual territorial disputes between two states that resulted in conflict. And I'm only going to talk about 3 examples of them because God knows there are more examples, but these are sort of the more infamous ones and kind of ones that aren't talked about much anymore, except for in America or in the States where these happen. So, I want to open by talking about Toledo. Yes. I'll any of my international listeners, I would be really interested to know in the comments section how many of you have actually heard of Toledo. But I guess some people have. Toledo is sort of the next biggest city on the Great Lakes in between Cleveland and Detroit. In between those two. Now, if you go sort of northeast from there, you got Buffalo, and if you go all the way around into Lake Michigan, you got Milwaukee and Chicago. But Toledo, it was a major port city. It always has been a major port city. And so what happened was in the good old 1830s, Ohio and Michigan had a bit of a problem. Okay, so first thing, we got to roll it back to 1787 before we move up to the 1830s. In 1787, we made this thing called the Northwest Territory in America, and basically, states it laid out a groundwork for how we were gonna settle and divide states west of the Alleghenies in the northwestern corner. Why I call it Northwest Territory. It's no longer the Northwest Territory. Obviously, we've moved farther north and west from it, but So basically, the states Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin are all based off of this pattern, this developed pattern. But there was a problem, okay? There was a huge, huge, huge problem. Was when they started bringing states into statehood, even though they had perfectly laid out these things with sections and townships and ranges and evenly divided things and had a pretty good system, they had one big problem when you start to create survey lines across from Lake Michigan and Lake Erie, it's not really straight. So the area that is modern day the southern boundary of Michigan was always kind of disputed because it's just not straight. It's not very good. There were several surveying fights over it. Well, Ohio and Indiana had already been states for a very long time. People don't actually realize that Indiana became a state in 1816 and Ohio was shortly before that. But Michigan didn't become one until 1835 and Wisconsin didn't become one until 1848. So they were much older, they were much younger. And I guess a lot of it was because of their northern they were a little bit farther north. The weather was a little more inhospitable, and they were a little less dense in the beginning, and it created a lot of problems at this period in American history because these areas were definitely becoming influential areas, but they were having trouble gaining that statehood marker. So in 1835, it was time for Michigan. Michigan had finally earned the right to become a state, except there was one problem. Michigan, they got a radical young governor of their territory, and his name was Stevens Thomas Mason, and he said, you know what, this is bull crap. Okay, he was also related to Thomas Mason, who was a Virginia Supreme Court justice, very influential kind of guy, and he said this is bull crap. We should be given, we should basically get this stretch of Toledo because that's what the original survey said, supposedly. We should get this 468 square mile stretch that would have included basically uh, Toledo and sort of a few miles in either direction all the way across. Um, so he decided that he decided that it was becoming really difficult. He decided to make it quite crazy and declared, basically, uh, he declared that territory part of Michigan when they applied for statehood in 1835. And he went around enforcing laws, Michigan laws, in this part of Ohio. And, well, as you can imagine, the Ohio governor decided that was a problem. We can't have some guy running around here claiming that this happened. So what happened? Governor Lucas actually put 500 troops out there, and Ohio responded by also sending troops. And for a full year, there was sort of on and off skirmishes on the border, and everybody started fleeing Toledo because they were being menaced by Michigan authorities for for calling themselves Ohioans, and it was really getting awkward. And fortunately, Andrew Jackson, a lot of this is really funny because this happened during Jackson's presidency. And if there's a lot of people know Jackson as sort of a hothead, they call him tough as Hickory Jackson. And he was a hothead, okay? I mean, he'd been in duels and was sort of seen as a crazy person to be president. But in this, sort everybody basically figured he resolved disputes by the end of the bayonet. When South Carolina threatened to secede, he said threatened to nullify the tariff. He said he was going to go hang every one of them by their neck. Very intense language. But in this particular instance, Jackson was actually the one that was able to negotiate a diffusion of the situation. And he basically came in there and said, "Okay, uh, I see that this is becoming a tension situation, so I'm going to offer to give you guys what would today become the Upper Peninsula of Michigan." And basically, this area then ended up not becoming part of Wisconsin, even though it would have been a natural fit. And a lot of people saw this as a raw deal, but they ended up taking it, and it eventually caused the end of tensions in 1836. And the iron ore and timber, if you factor in the economics behind it, has actually really benefited the state of Michigan. And the tourism still does bring in some money to the state of Michigan. So it wasn't necessarily a raw deal, but it is quite a crazy chapter of American history to think of one territory just running into a city as major as Toledo and just trying to take it over from another state. Um, we don't really we have other skirmishes. Again, I'm going to talk about two other ones, but we've never really seen quite something like that before or since. And I don't know. I'm just really interested to see if this happens in other countries. I mean, obviously, we have another example in sort of India with the Pakistan Bangladesh partitions and the fight over where the actual line is in Kashmir or something, but it's just crazy to sort of think about this kind of thing happening. So yeah, now moving on to the next one. Um, a lot of people don't actually know much about the history of the secession of West Virginia. We're just told in history books that some counties in Northern Virginia didn't want to be a part of the war, and therefore they seceded and joined the Union during the Civil War. And that's a half truth. It's kind of true, but it's not totally true. So basically, what happened is that there were definitely groups of people in the Wheeling part of West Virginia. So the very northern part of West Virginia, the part that actually sticks out in between Ohio and Pennsylvania, that did not want to join the Confederacy and were very upset that Virginia joined the Confederacy. They just didn't want to be a part of it. They didn't want to be in a civil war. A lot of people say, "Oh, it's because they were anti-slavery." Not really. I mean, yes, they were kinda. There was not. There was definitely a lower amount of slavery in West Virginia than there was in Virginia, but it wasn't like that. I mean, they really just didn't want to be in a civil war. They just thought it was ridiculous. Virginia was seceding, and they didn't want to be in a war. So these people then turned around and started a movement to secede from Virginia. And on October 24th of 1861, they got residents of 39 counties to approve Virginia to be a new Unionist state. Now, obviously, you can't just secede from a state, especially back then. I'm not really sure how much power states still wield today. I think it legitimately says in our Constitution that you can't just secede from a state. But um, any, except for Texas is allowed to break into 6 states by some weird law. Anyway, they decided, oh, we're gonna secede. Well, nearing this, obviously, the Confederate troops, and what's really crazy about this too is that Richmond, Virginia was technically the capital of the Confederacy. So the capital of the Union is Washington, D.C., and the capital of the Confederacy is Richmond, Virginia. They're not that far apart. And, this is just crazy. There's so much contention, and you would expect them to both have capitals. You would expect, like, the capital of the Union to be somewhere in New York and the capital of the Confederacy to be somewhere in, like, Alabama, but that's not how it worked. So, what happened is the Confederate troops tried to march back in and take it over because there were definitely a lot of Confederate, basically all the biggest cities in the Shenandoah Valley. A lot of the biggest cities up in what is now West Virginia. They were actually pro Confederacy. Again, this is the if you look at West Virginia, the very top tip was the strong point that wanted to be in the Union. It sort of weakened as it went down, and then of course in the Shenandoah Valley, more near to what is still modern day Virginia, there was a lot of pro Union sentiment. So they thought they would just march in and take it back. This is a sort of rogue part of our state. We just need it. And, it does make sense if you've ever driven there, which I'm sure most of my international people haven't. To get into West Virginia from Richmond, you have to take almost a harrowing drive. I mean, obviously it's an interstate, but it's crazy. It's up and down, very mountainous. In fact, in West Virginia, they have these things called truck runaway ramps, which basically means if your brakes are failing or something on one of these hills, you can just pull off the interstate into this gravel uphill ditch and it will stop you. I mean, that's the type of road we're talking about coming in there. So yeah, it seemed like this was a cut off rogue area, but good old Lincoln and the Union, they saw this as a enormous opportunity to stick something in somebody's face. So what they did was they marched a bunch of Union Army people down in there, and basically cut off the Confederate Army before it could get in there. And they did a full statehood vote in 50 counties that now form modern day West Virginia. And it turned out overwhelmingly pro-union, something like 18,164 to 514 against. People say this is not a legitimate ballot still to this day. And I don't know, it's a very interesting, that they went through the effort just to I mean, don't get me wrong, okay? There are some resources in West Virginia. And at the time, it was a very big coal hub. It still is one of the leading coal producers in the United States, but it's always also been one of the poorest and most challenged states. It's due to its geographic nature, it is just hard to do a lot of things there. It's just it's like they have two big universities, Marshall and the University of West Virginia, and even then, having some top tier universities, you still hear about all kinds of struggles there. Poverty is very high there. They have constant chemical problems in water, all kinds of difficult things. And, it's just a cut off kind of place because of the way this went down. And to think that the Union Army and Lincoln spent this much effort just to secure this for these people, just to rub it in Virginia's face, is rather wild. And nobody really talks about this anymore because we just all take it for granted that West Virginia became its own state. But if anyone tried that today, no one would come to their aid like that. And that's something I listened to a very interesting BBC series because they were talking about Catalonia, and they had a very interesting series called "How Do You Become a Country?" Because the last new country in the world that has been formed was South Sudan, and I'm sure everybody remembers how much craziness went down to form South Sudan. And basically, in this documentary, it said the biggest factor is somebody recognizing you, right? So, if some part of a state went rogue and tried to declare freedom, like there's been movements still called Forgotonia, and there's this movement in Tennessee called for Jackson, Tennessee, or something. You need a larger power to recognize you, and that's why this West Virginia thing ended up happening. But it still feels weird, It's something that feels like it shouldn't have happened here, like. So, yeah, Virginia has gotten, it's very weird. So when you ask people about it, they just always assume that it was because they were like these staunch Unionists that wanted to protect their part of Virginia from slavery and secession and the stigma. But that's really not the truth. It's more so there were some that did, and Lincoln saw it as an opportunity to put some forces in there. So, and it may have worked. The other thing that may have worked about that too was I live in Kentucky, the bordering state to West Virginia, and we remained a border state the entire Civil War. We didn't choose a side, but we had both Union and Confederate governments running parallel and troops running parallel at the same time. And maybe part of the reason that a full secession never happened was because, Lincoln shoved this part of Virginia and cut it off kind of from the influence of Richmond. I don't know. Maybe that was the strategy behind it, but it's still a crazy thing to think of happening. So the last thing I wanted to wrap it up talking about, the third skirmish is I'm going to talk about the bloody Kansas Missouri thing. So, or bleeding Kansas, and there's a Kansas Missouri thing. So Missouri has always been Missouri was a slave state. It was admitted to the Union as a slave state, and basically in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the compromise that was supposed to hold us together and prevent a civil war was that both states were going to, as they became states, were going to get to decide whether they were slavery or anti-slave based on the popular vote. Well, this became very problematic, right? Because, you know, there were people of both in the territories. Both states were originally part of the Missouri Territory, so there were lots of people from both sides there. And when Missouri became a slave state, you know, there was quite a heated fight by people to move across the border and bring in the slave influence because Southerners were worried about another free state. You know, that was the way it was sort of operated back then. Was where they were trying to bring in one for another, but it just never totally worked. So anyway, what happened is there was a bunch of bloody violence at the polls, and a lot of people in these different random clashes over this. Basically, 30 to 40 people died. You know, or basically almost 100 people between both sides died trying to make it to the polls. Little attacks on voting places, and in between all the skirmishes, and it's just crazy. They moved the capital a couple times based upon whether a pro-slavery, anti-slavery group had taken over the had taken over the state legislature, and it was wild. But basically, at the end of the day, it took the Civil War actually breaking out for Congress to accept Kansas into statehood as a free state, and it's that's quite wild. So yeah. Anyway, the Kansas ended up becoming a free state. Well, um, as you know, there are still rivalries for these sorts of things. There's rivalries between the two major colleges. There are colleges in Michigan and Ohio, in Kansas and Missouri. There was a big border battle between Kansas and Missouri. They play everybody each year in football and basketball. And it was a point of pride that everybody was taking. Unfortunately, Missouri left the Big 12 conference and is now in the SEC, and they don't play each other anymore. But Ohio State and Michigan still play in the Big 10 in football and basketball every year, and it is intense. These schools hate each other with a passion. They hate each other's fan bases with a passion. And it all comes back to sort of this contention over Toledo. And then what was really wild is over the past couple seasons, the football coaches for Ohio State and Michigan were both born in Toledo on the border between. And it's quite wild. I don't know what would I'm glad that I don't know if there's ever going to be total peace there because of the result of this. So anyway, I just thought I would talk about a couple of these. I put links so you can read far more into them than you want to, and you can also check out that interesting show, How the States Got Their Shapes. And thanks for listening, everybody. Peace out.